Now, negotiators from almost 200 countries are under pressure to deliver a final agreement at the UN Climate Change Conference. Divides between North and South, particularly over a fund for compensation for loss and damage, have extended talks until tomorrow. Arise Environment correspondent Leila Salami reports.
Pressure is mounting in Sharm el-Sheikh as climate talks enter their final day gridlocked by a division between rich and developing nations over compensation for loss and damage. Representatives from almost 200 nations have come together at COP27 for almost 2 weeks to drive action forward on climate change, as the world faces a worsening onslaught of heat waves, droughts and floods. Addressing leaders on Thursday, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres asked nations to stand and deliver.
I'm here to appeal to all parties to rise to this moment and to the greatest challenge that humanity is facing. The world is watching, and there's a simple message to all of us: stand and deliver.
In a proposal to delegates late on Thursday, European Commission Vice President Frans Timmermans said the EU was open to the creation of a fund to help the most vulnerable countries, but one that places responsibility not just on rich nations, but on all large polluters, including China.
What we would propose is to establish a loss and damage response fund for the most vulnerable countries by the CMA and under Article 8 of the Paris Agreement. The details of this fund will be designed in accordance with a work plan also to be agreed at the CMA and in a way that would enable it to receive financing from sources from a broad donor base.
This proposal could corner the United States, as the EU and US had previously resisted the idea, fearing it could open the door to establishing legal liability. Early on Friday, the UN published a draft text of the COP27 deal, but it provides no solution on loss and damage. Instead, it contains a placeholder text indicating that delegates are still negotiating on the matter. With the 2-week conference officially due to wrap up on Friday, but little progress made on loss and damage, negotiators in Egypt are expecting the talks to go into overtime. The tussle continues, but there is slight progress as the world awaits the final outcome. Leila Salami, Arise News.
Well, for more on this, let's speak to Arise Environment correspondent Leila Salami, who joins us from our Lagos studios. Good to see you, Leila. And I know you've probably gone over some of what we're going to be talking about, but it's probably worth getting into it a bit more. This was supposed to be the final day of the UN Climate Summit in Egypt. Delegates will now talk into Saturday, as you said. They're down to the wire now. Why do things appear to be going so badly?
You know, Charles, delegates just cannot seem to come to an agreement on certain things. And yes, the COP27 presidency has announced that the talks will now continue till Saturday. Now, bear in mind, this could still change. If an agreement isn't reached by tomorrow, this could still change. It could still be a couple days before we see something. It all depends on how things go. Things have been a deadlock, but last night there was a bit of movement because the EU, who had initially resisted a fund for loss and damage, came forward to say that they would support a fund, but on certain conditions. Now, these conditions are firstly that the fund only focuses on the most vulnerable countries, as opposed to all developing nations, which is what the G77 plus China were pushing for. Now, the G77 group is made up of 134 nations, and they were pushing for all developing countries to have access to this fund. The second condition of this fund is that it's not just rich nations paying into it, but the largest emitters. Now, this does suggest that the EU would like China and India to step up as well and pay into this fund. We haven't heard from the United States yet with regards to this. The United States were initially opposed to the idea of a fund, and we don't know where the US stands now that the EU has come forward to support this fund. The exact same thing with China. We're still not sure as to where China stands. So even though there's slight progress on loss and damage, there's still negotiations to continue. We still don't know if all 200 or just under 200 groups of leaders that are there or negotiators that are there from different countries are going to agree on this. So that's one of the things that's holding up the talks at the moment. And then, of course, if we go into global temperature rise, etc., there's still issues around that. So technical details still haven't been agreed upon, and the world is waiting.
Well, you talked about the temperature issue. I mean, I was trying to see if we could take a brief look at other things that such as, you know, trying to hit that elusive vanishing target of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. I mean, what are you hearing about that?
So based on the draft agreement that's been published by the United Nations, it does look like the COP27 agreement is going to be quite similar to the Glasgow Climate Pact that was done at COP26 last year with regards to global temperature rise, because the draft agreement currently holds the goal at well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. However, it's interesting because earlier on this year, the sixth assessments, the IPCC sixth assessment reports came out, and the sixth assessment report basically said that even if the world aims to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, that is still going to come with terrible ramifications. And the world needs to focus on keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So if the agreement that's going to come out of COP27 is going to hold this goal at 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees, that's not great news, particularly for the scientists that have been going on about how much of an issue this is. The world is already at about 1.1 or 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we're already getting there. So it's quite worrying to see, because campaigners, scientists, environmentalists, and the world really would have wanted to see some sort of progress and change, and not holding on to the Glasgow Climate Pact and the goals stated there, especially given the information that's come out with science since the last COP happened in Glasgow last year.
Well, I mean, given all what you've gone through, quite sort of meticulously and methodically there, Leila, I mean, I'm wondering what it is that they're going to sign off on tomorrow, given that there are all these key issues that remain unresolved and are still entrenched in these talks.
Well, we have to wait and see. Like I said, we may not even get the final agreement tomorrow. For now, that does look like the deadline, but this could go on for another few days. And yes, Charles, there's several issues here. And it looks like, quite frankly, you know, this was dubbed an African COP because there should have been a lot of focus on Africa at COP27 this year, given that it's taking place on the continent. However, these are decisions that are going to impact Africa. And right now, it doesn't look like Africa is coming out of this with a win. For example, for Africa to come out of this with a win, what should be in these documents that we're seeing from the United Nations should be that limit of 1.5 degrees or below 1.5 degrees. There should be a fund on loss and damage already agreed on. So we have to wait and see what happens. And of course, the loss and damage fund, it's going to be interesting to see what China and the United States come back with, and India as well. I'm not sure if China and India were expecting that the negotiations were going to get to a point where they were going to be put in a position to possibly also have to pay into the loss and damage fund. But to the EU and to richer nations, that makes sense based on their current emissions. They may not have the same emissions over time as a lot of these rich nations, but these are large industrial nations now. So we'll wait and see what happens. But as things currently stand, the agreement is looking very similar to the Glasgow Climate Pact. So that's why it's being met with quite a lot of criticism. But then again, it's still a draft agreement and things can change, although personally I'm not sure how much is going to change from what we're already seeing.
Leila, thanks very much indeed, and I apologize if we made you repeat yourself in that chat, but we needed to be very clear on some of those very confusing issues that lots of people are trying to get their heads around. Leila Johnson Salami is a RISE environment correspondent, and she was talking to me there from our studios in Lagos.